Hello and welcome to this
Good.
program. It's sponsored by Channing Memorial Church's Learning Center, the church's Adult Education Committee. As most of you know, Channing's a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Our humanistic spiritual focus leads us to be curious about many topics and committed to important causes. Since we're meeting virtually, we can't ask for in-person donations for TLC. We do encourage you, if you're so inclined, to write a check to Channing, memo TLC for the collection plate when you're in the church. Tonight's talk, presented by the Reverend Jeannette Bessinger, is entitled Gen Z and the Pandemic, a Lasting Impact. Reverend Bessinger is an ordained interfaith chaplain and certified spiritual director. She did her undergraduate work at Columbia University and graduate work in theological social change and chaplaincy at Starr King School for the Ministry. She's serving now as Director of Spiritual Development at Westminster Unitarian Church in East Greenwich. In the early days of her health ministry, Jeannette authored books, recipes, and mind-body-spirit musings, which were showcased in many media outlets, including Consumer Reports, The Washington Post, NPR, and NBC News. As a body-mind speaker, preacher, and award-winning teacher, she's worked with thousands of people from many different communities, offering support through challenging changes in their lives. Jeannette has offered several programs for TLC in the past, including Spiritual First Aid for COVID times and a series on building beloved community. She's spoken quite frequently from the pulpit at Channing. On a personal note, Jeannette's been a part of Channing Memorial Church for over 50 years, growing up through the formative religious education program here in the 70s, and she's the daughter of Judy Porter. She'll be pleased to answer your questions. Probably what will work best is to write them into the chat function as you think of them, or save them till the end if you prefer. And in a group of this size, we can probably just speak up and ask the questions as they come up. But if you like, you can also raise your hand or raise the hand that's part of your setup on your screen. Jeannette, we're so pleased you're here with us for tonight, and we've been looking forward so much to your talk. I now turn it over to you with our thanks.
Thank you, Susan. I just muted everybody, and I'm thinking in terms of the questions, we'll have to figure it out as we go, because I'm going to do screen sharing, so I'll only be able to see a few of you at a time. So you probably would have to use the raise hands signal. But we'll figure it out. Make a note so you don't forget if we go by, because we're going to do a whole arc, and then we'll have some time to talk for sure at the end as well. I appreciate that big introduction, Susan. I'm gonna talk a lot to start at the beginning, and I'll share an informational slide deck. And then I'm going to move into some suggestions for things that we might do. This is really an emerging issue all over the country, and nobody has solid answers. So we'll be brainstorming tonight. We'll be in good company doing some brainstorming and having a little discussion, and I'll take questions too. Excuse me. I started researching this project for a graduate class last year. And I already knew something about the mental health challenges that Gen Z was facing even before the pandemic. And I was interested to know if it had made things worse, and if so, how, and just to get a sense of whether there might be some new or better ways that we could support our young people as a society, but particularly as spiritual caregivers. And I have to tell you, what I learned when I started digging in, frankly, it shocked me. And I realized as I started sharing the data that at that time, what was happening wasn't widely known or understood. And Susan and I were talking about this a little bit before. If you have kids in your house, you have more of a sense of this. It's starting to come through schools and things like that are starting to talk about some of this stuff. But if you don't have kids actively in your life, you may not know that we are in fact in a crisis. And so I feel like it is an important thing just to kind of get that information out. And normally in a presentation like this, I would do intros and I would be working to balance the challenging with the uplifting, but in the interest of relative brevity and actually just sharing what could be potentially impactful for ministry and other supports for this population, I'm just going to focus on the information in hopes that it will catalyze each of us to take some personal action, even if it's in small ways. This past spring, I don't know if you saw the headlines, but the US Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, he started calling the increase in youth mental health needs the defining public health crisis of our time. The issue that we need to focus on. And there's that old saying that children are our future. And at the Unitarian Universalist at the GA Assembly, General Assembly this year, the statement was made that actually children are our present. And this is one of the paradigm shifts that I believe we're going to need to make if we're going to be able to turn this situation around in our country. So according to a very significant poll last year, was conducted by MTV of all places and the Center for Public Affairs Research, Gen Z reported the most stress in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic of all the different age groups. So they were the most impacted. And in the research I gathered, I narrowed my focus to the US and I concentrated on resources that were broken out for race, because racial, gender, sexuality, and other disparities are very underreported typically, and they're vital to understanding really truly what the impacts are that are happening right now. So just so you know, I tried to reference very well accredited resources and statistically significant studies. And I chose in the deck to share them by resource instead of mixing them up with the link on the slide, just for clarity. So I'm going to move through them quickly, just highlighting maybe one point each. I actually took a whole bunch out, so there's a lot more to it, but I wanted to give you the basic arc. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. If that's all right. Okay. And can everybody see? All right. That's great. So I can only see 4 of you. So again, if you want to interrupt or jump in, put that little hand signal up or we'll catch it at the end. So, all right. This is just the overview. I'm going to do the context of the impact and then focus on mental health, focus on spirituality and religion, and then an actual a series of interviews that I did with young people last year. I'm going to sort of summarize some of the information I got there. So this generation, there were a few different possible names. They were going to call them Homelanders. They were going to call them I generation. It landed on Gen Z, was sort of what grabbed the popular name. And the salient feature of this generation is it's the very first one to grow up with the always on technology, meaning that they have primary access to the digital world through mobile devices, meaning that they take connection with them everywhere they go. This is the first generation that's actually born into that situation. So the early waves of COVID-19, they affected adolescents directly and indirectly. And beyond getting sick, their social, emotional, mental well-being was impacted by the pandemic, along with all of us. But what's important about this is that the these traumas were experienced during key developmental stages. And it's possible, and in fact likely, that this could have long-term consequences across their lifespan. So depending who was hit by what, at which age during this time, this is one of the things that is being tracked right now and that we're looking at, and there's a lot of concern around it. And so these are some of the things that, we know that people were facing. The physical isolation had one of the most significant impacts. So being cut off from the rest of humanity at this age was very, very impactful. There was a lot of home and food insecurity that specifically impacted adolescents. Now, these slides, if you look at this, the bottom one, this is the one that just shocked me. I had no idea this was going on. So at this time, and this the resource for this is Kids Count data. You can access it by date, and it's very solid data. 33% of the Gen Z adolescents in this country and slightly younger were likely to lose their home through eviction or foreclosure. 1 in 3 children in this country were facing that. And look at this, 39% of Black or 2 or more races. So Black or mixed races, 40% were likely to lose their home. The hidden pandemic was the abuse that happened in here as well. I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but because of the nature of being enclosed, being in lock-in together, there was a very sharp increase. It was difficult to collect the data. It was problematic to get accurate data, but there was an alarming rise in domestic homicides, in persons seeking shelters, and informal reports of abuse on social media. And so they analyzed 1 million tweets to get these particular statistics. And again, this is something that really was not talked about, but was being faced by an enormous number of young people. So this is the big one. According to a 2019 Pew report, even before the pandemic even started, there was serious concern about mental health, and it cut across gender, racial, socioeconomic lines, with roughly equal shares of teens across demographic groups, all of them saying, yes, this is a significant issue in our community. If you look over here, anxiety and depression, 70% across all those demographics saying, yeah, this is a major problem for us. The suicide rate, again, before the pandemic, increased by nearly 60% between 2007 and 2017. So this, and we're going to talk about social media in the next slide, but there's a sense that there is a correlation here. This is one of the things that they're looking at very closely, is this internet access connection. So it was in 2020, in December of 2020, that the Surgeon General issued the first serious public health advisory to address youth mental health. And at that point, he said, this is an actual crisis and it needs our immediate attention. And then last April is when he came out and said, this is the crisis. It is not getting better. It's a significant and very dangerous problem. So this is the new report as of last May, and some of you may have heard about it. You certainly have if you're involved in education. So in the new advisory is actually about social media and the link with youth mental health. So now they are actually tracking, that department is putting those two issues together. And there are sort of 2 levels of impact. One of them is obvious, like content exposure, what you see and what happens. But then the other one is actually excessive and problematic use. So they're looking at these 2 things, and they've been doing these very intensive studies, and they're starting to see a kind of a quorum of relative data, and they're starting to draw conclusions, which a lot of us have been intuiting, but now we actually have hard data. We have research to back this up. So if you look at the content exposure, the things that are big issues are the normalizing of self-harm and suicidal ideation, body dissatisfaction, and all the things that come with that. This one is very, very disturbing. 2/3 of adolescents sometimes or often are exposed to hate-based content. 2/3 are exposed to this. And BIPOC girls, Black, Indigenous, people of color, report monthly exposure to racist content or language. So this is coming through directly to them on a regular basis. And then predatory behaviors, which we have been aware of, but it's particularly targeting adolescent girls and transgender youth. So the second part, which is kind of the new part to move into the research field, is this what they're seeing is they're seeing brain changes in young people who are using social media quite a bit. They're starting to see the kinds of changes that you see in addicts. Their brains are beginning to change in that way. So this is kind of, it's strangely worded, like social media use may be attributable to self-control challenges magnified by habit formation. What that means is the choices that they're making to be online may be as much about addiction as about choice. In other words, not a choice. And so this is very, very important information. And basically every parent already knows this, but you can't just ask a 9-year-old to turn off their game and expect them to do it. It's, imagine asking a gambling addict to just walk away in the middle of a race that they were betting on. And now imagine that that gambling addict was 12. That is what we are talking about at this level. And so they're actually starting to see, to see what's going on and study what's going on inside of the brain. And it's about stimulating the reward center. And if we have time, I really wasn't sure about this, but it's fascinating and problematic. I will talk about Our Whole Lives, OWL, and the human sexuality program taught by UUs. But there is a very specific issue going on with sexuality, pornography, and digital media and the reward center of the brain that is actually having a very powerful effect on young people and their sexuality. So if we have time, we can talk about that a little bit later. So COVID upped depression all over the world, increased it to 25% worldwide. And the depression rate, and this is not just adolescents, this is across the board, increased to 33%. Younger groups, Black, Indigenous, people of color were more affected than others. Gen Z had the least positive outlook as we were coming out of COVID. So I just want to highlight this orange slide here. You can see, you can read what's going on here, but Gen Z actually relies on the emergency room and social media and digital tools primarily to access their care, but they're less satisfied with behavioral health services in general. So they're actually looking for a personal connection, a one-to-one trusted, real-time, in-person experience, but they're only using digital access means. So they want people, but they're only reaching out online. And so there's a big disconnect there. And that's a part of the reason why they're struggling, because we can't get the services directly to them. All right, I want to shift over to spirituality here. And I'm leaning mostly into the Springtide research here. This is a very, very strong study. They did 15,000 people, comprehensive study. It was weighted for age and gender and region to match the demographics of the country. So they're saying, you know, maybe produce an error margin of plus or minus 3%. So this is pretty accurate research here. So the millennials were beginning to unbundle spirituality from a kind of hierarchical church framework. So in the past, spirituality is largely associated with religions, not across the board, but in the country that was a big trend, and that has begun to unravel, and particularly with the millennials. So disaffiliation is very high. 1 in 3 millennials do not belong to any faith community, and it's actually 40%, it's even higher for Gen Z. And they are actively seeking out spiritual pursuits and spiritual community, but it's parsed out. So they look for kind of their social justice work over here, and they might look for giving over here, and they might look for they're unbundling this and reaching out in a very, very different way to find community. It's really communities. And this one, this slide over here encapsulates this so beautifully. So Gen Z has increased connectivity, but decreased connection. And the American millennial, I love this quote, it feels more comfortable setting up a Kiva loan to a farmer in Kenya than bringing chicken soup to a neighbor. So that is the experience, that they are very involved in and interested in spiritual pursuit, but they're pursuing this in very different ways and in kind of siloed, not all together under one umbrella. Loneliness, social isolation, and stress post-pandemic, these are extremely high. In terms of the loneliness slide here, so 33% feeling completely alone. It turns out that even those who are involved in spiritual communities, there was a very little margin of difference, whether a youth was involved with a church or not. So they are feeling this across the board, which means we are not meeting this need in churches institutionally across the country. We're not addressing this issue effectively. This one blew my mind. 69%, almost 70% of youth report having 3 or fewer meaningful human interactions on a given day. That is the average of their life, 3 or fewer meaningful human interactions. And then the stress that's unsurprising, feeling stressed and overwhelmed overall. So this I thought was interesting, just broken down by race. So you can see the highest level of experiencing the sense of feeling completely alone is that experience is American Indian or Alaska Native is 43%. And yeah. I also thought this was interesting. They did a measurement of young people's trust in institutions from no trust at all to complete trust. So it's a 1 to a 10. And if you look at organized religion, the trust of organized religion is just under a 5. So kind of in the middle, but that's really pretty low. And look at all of these nonprofits, 5, banks, 5, medical system, 5, presidency, 4. This is the trust level that they are feeling for our significant institutions. Now, I dropped a bunch of slides here to save time. I was talking in here about the difference between transactional relationships versus something called relational authority. So Gen Z is not interested in transactional adult relationships. They do not care about your credentials. They don't want to hear it. They're not interested in sort of a give and take in the traditional, the kind of classical ways, and they're definitely not interested in a pyramid, a power differential relationship where the adult is up here and they are down here. What they are looking for, and this Springtide came up with this term relational authority. I'm not crazy about it because of the word authority, but it's understood that authority is the ability to positively and successfully impact, influence, and transmit values. So this doesn't mean authoritarian. It's not bossy, dictatorial, domineering, and it doesn't mean authoritative, meaning you're just in charge because you have access to power. So relational authority is based on a dynamic exchange of shared experience and sympathetic expertise. And so these are the qualities in adults that earn their trust. Do you listen to them? Really, truly listen to them? Are you transparent about your agenda, about where you're coming from, about who you are? Do you have integrity? Gen Z very much cares about this in terms of trust. Do you walk your talk or not? Do you care about them? Are you demonstrating care? Do you remember things that they told you? Do you remember their name? Do you, these are small details that are extremely meaningful for them. And then your expertise, if you're supposed to be good at something, they want you to be good at it. They don't want to see your credential. They want you to show and demonstrate that you are who you say you are. And so all of these things together, these are the categories that were broken down by this organization to kind of put together a picture of the kind of adult, or the qualities in an adult that feels trustworthy for Gen Z. This is also very, very interesting. So 61% of young people said they felt completely disconnected from people in a virtual setting. So they're there, but they're not experiencing connection. Half of them say that they don't feel heard in an environment. And this one's huge. So while they were all in school with teachers, 57% of them said that they didn't feel like they could ask questions of authority figures in these spaces. So this is something to remember, that if we had Gen Z people in this call, they would not feel comfortable reaching out, asking questions, challenging. They would not feel connected to this group. And again, I want to talk about kind of why that might be. I have some thoughts about it, not based on the research. Okay, so this is the last slide before the sort of ideas for things that we can do. So I went into charter schools, and I spoke to 11th graders last year. And I chose 11th grade because they were the most deeply impacted in terms of their schooling. They started high school in 9th grade, and then they had 2 years, 10th. They had a year and a half out of it, and then they came back. And so I chose people from the same classes, self-selected, so they could interview in groups, and they already knew each other. 45% of them identified as male, 45% identified female, 10% identified non-binary, 70% white, and 30% BIPOC. And I did not ask about ableness or sexuality or race breakdowns. I was trying to just earn their trust really quickly and get the conversation started. And so it turns out they were absolutely, I was a complete stranger, and they were absolutely thrilled to be able to talk about their COVID experiences. They found it extremely valuable. And that interview process turned out to be something, according to the self-reporting of the teens, but also from the teachers, there was something healing about that experience for them. And that was not my intention at the time, but that was a byproduct, that making a safe space for them to talk about these things made an impact, a positive impact on them. So from the teachers, we heard that the youth coming back were immature for their age. And I've actually since continued to hear this. This is not adjusted. The sense that I'm getting from teachers is that all the ages are appearing immature as compared to prior to COVID. They're not inclined to do for themselves. This was interesting. They said they're more anxious in general. They're noticing that they're easily triggered emotionally. So the youth themselves reported this kind of stuff under the school. Their head hurt all the time. I heard that over and over again, that they had a constant headache through COVID. I thought this is interesting. They never had any time off because they never had any time on. So they just felt like they were pressured for school all the time. It wasn't super effective, and they actually really hated hybrid. They said that was so much more challenging than being 100% online, because trying to toggle back and forth, or having some people live in the classroom and some people on Zoom, felt completely ineffective. And several of them were like, I just gave up. Like, I just stopped even trying. Socially, old friends fell away. They felt very lonely. And they said a few things like, what is relaxing to them is what is live encounters. They call that relaxation time, when they're with their peers physically. And they said, we need at least one live session per week, meaning that's like, and I'm thinking like for 11th graders, like being with their peers live once a week is sort of keeping them alive, basically. 20% of them describe significant social anxiety. This came up again and again, and I think it's connected to this. So I asked them specifically about how they interact online. So at that time, they were using Discord, Snapchat was big, Instagram, mostly text, some calling at that point. They don't call really anymore at all, and they don't email anymore nowadays. They chat through text pretty, at least for quick communications. But this was what was so fascinating. They described two distinct lives. Their person-to-person life and their online life. And it was almost as if they had two different personalities. And so they would say, and they're in the classrooms, they would say, oh yeah, we're friends online, but we're not friends in the classroom. Or vice versa. We're friends in the classroom, but we're not friends online. And so they had these totally different worlds going on, both of them kind of equally active, but not connected to each other. I was so fascinated kind of listening to this. The big thing they said about texting and online communication, and they connected this with the social anxiety, they said that when you're online, and especially when you're texting, you have time to think about what you're going to say. You can plan it, you can change it, there's like a gap. But when you're face to face, you have to say it and respond in the moment. And that was super problematic, not for all of them, but for about 1 in 5 felt paralyzed. And there were a couple who said they couldn't even, they could not do it. They would start to speak and they would just freeze up, and they would, they couldn't do it. And so they were able to open up and talk about this in the room, but this is the kind of thing that they were facing. And they also talked about, they changed so much physically, like during that time, that sort of getting used to seeing everyone like this. And then suddenly when everyone took all their masks off, they felt incredibly exposed. They were shocked about how weird everyone looked. Like there was a whole interesting thing around seeing the faces. When I asked them what I wasn't thinking to ask, they said that they felt like they had too much freedom. They lost all sense of boundary, and they lost their motivation. So they felt like there's just too much time to be alone in their heads. That's kind of what they came up with on their own. They did talk about, I asked, were there gifts, were there positive things? And most of them said that they felt like they had matured. They felt like there were, they had a chance to be alone. There were some good things about that. They found new interests. They deepened some of their interests. Some of them said they improved their relationships with their parents, partially because they were just spending more time with them. And a couple of them said they found a career interest. And so these were kind of positive things rolling out from there. And so this is my last slide before I put these away and we shift gears here. So which aspects of the mental health crisis could be teased out, and how can we support some of these things, particularly through spiritual or religious institutions, but also just as significant adults connected to kids in a whole myriad of different ways. I mean, just being a neighbor to people actually matters and can have an impact. The biggest in kind of global issues are it's a crisis of connection. It's a real crisis of connection. And it's that thing about being like super high connectivity and super low actual connection to the different parts of themselves, those digital divides with that strange sense of, different people inside, peer-to-peer disconnection, youth to adult disconnection, disconnection to local and immediate communities. There's a greater connection in some ways to the global community. And I left some of these slides out, but Gen Z is extremely, extremely concerned about and motivated to do something about environmental crises. For them, that is the number one concern is the environment. And they felt that they believed that the COVID crisis brought that crisis up into people's awareness, and that maybe we could have some change, but this is a hugely important area for them. And so it's something that they feel very motivated to change around the world. And then the second part, so crisis of connection and actually moral injury, meaning that they have in a way been, they're experiencing a woundedness from leaning into the belief that they would be cared for, that their environment that they live in would be cared for, that these large institutions are supposed to take care of them, and that they have let them down in a very significant way. And so this is a heart issue. This is a spiritual wounding issue, as well as just a practical issue. And I'll just jump down here. There was a really interesting study, a worldwide study, and the belief that most of the youth population in the world articulated as being in agreement about was that society is facing a crisis of leadership because there aren't enough good leaders right now. And so they have lost faith in leadership, and they believe that different qualities are necessary for leadership in this day and age than have been in the past. And they themselves don't necessarily feel equipped to step into that role. So that damage, that sense of being wounded or not cared for in past generations, like in a way, this is a classic generational story, right? The generation before you botched things up in this way or let you down. But the old story in this country has been the generation coming up says, well, we will solve it. We will fix this. This is our way of addressing these issues that you've left in our laps. Gen Z is feeling impotent and afraid. They do not have the confidence to step forward into the roles that are going to be needing to be taken up. Now, obviously, everything I'm saying is gigantic generalizations, and there are pockets and individuals, and this is not across the board. I'm talking about trends. I'm talking about kind of psychological canons that are common in this age group. So the kinds of things that they need: increasing meaningful adult interactions. And it doesn't have to be the old style mentor, I'm the authority and I will deign to be it's not that at all. Even just regular kind words, just listening, even to a stranger in a line at, the grocery store, or remembering something that they've said to you, remembering something about them, mentioning it to them. Doing those little kinds of reach outs are so much more significant in a way than they have ever been. It can actually, something like that can actually save a life at this point. And it's not an exaggeration to say that. Supporting them in their interests and their actions toward social change and building relevant leadership skills, really important. Helping to empower them with the skill set and the resiliency to feel like they can step into these roles is super important right now. And this is really an unfolding experiment, but effective sources of social media education, something that can break through. I didn't mention it when we hit that slide, but every single kid is on social media. It was like 94% or something from the slide before. Like everyone, it's just ubiquitous. And so all of those issues that are happening are hitting every kid on some level. And so some kind of education along the owls, like, sexuality involves a lot of potentially risky behaviors. You offer the owl training at every age, K through 12, at different ages, and actually older too. Something like this could be created for social media, understanding, what the dangers are, understanding how to boundary under this is, and the Surgeon General is actually calling for actual boundaries and limitations and restrictions to come from at the governmental level. And Pandora's out of the box in a way, but this is something that is being called for by the Surgeon General at this point. So maybe things will change. So I'm going to stop sharing here. There's definitely more to talk about, but I'll just ask you if off the cuff you have particular questions. There's another piece that I can talk about that digital thing, but I want to hear if people have questions. That was a lot. Thank you for being patient with all that. Is that your hand, Tom? You got to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I was worried about the dogs. There are a lot of recommendations to support Gen Z kids in this and in that, but how do you break that down? I mean, what kinds of support are meant? What are the different types of support here?
It depends. That completely depends on your capacity. If you're an educator, then it's as a teacher. If you are a neighbor, it's as a neighbor. It's you know, it's however you have organic connection with them.
Well, is it a matter of encouraging them in conversation, or is it a matter of getting involved organizationally, like being a, you know, a Boy Scout leader type of person or something like that?
Yes.
Yeah.
All of the above. And I would say in terms of encouraging conversation, I would lead with listening. Lead with listening, because they don't want to be talked to. They don't want to be told. They need to be heard. And so, and that of course involves getting them to speak. So there is that, but that involves earning their trust. And so that goes back to that like relational authority, like being a person that a young person can speak to, because trust is an enormous issue with this generation.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else? Anything bubbling?
Jeanette, it's Renee. Hi.
Hi.
I want to thank you for putting this together in a concise, straightforward manner. You know, I live with this. I've lived with this with my students through COVID, and I see them coming back, and it's, you know, it's a lot to hold and it's a lot to witness. And just for you to be able to put it in a, you know, in bulleted list form is helpful to me. So I'm going to thank you for the hard work that you did and the way that you put that out there today. It is not easy work right now.
It's not. And thank you for saying that. And thank you for being there for them, because I know you're one of those people, because I know you. And so I know you're a very important person in young people's lives right now. I know that for a fact. Eleanor, did you want to say something?
Yeah, the charts had so much information, and I was trying to write down stuff, and it was just going too fast. So from what one chart that really intrigued me was one that talked about young people feeling alone. And of course, I'm thinking about the enormous variety in individual experience when one is trapped in the house. One has no place to go. One can't go to school. I'm thinking of the variety of situations and what a difference that has to make in their total COVID experience. For example, some kids are one of 5 siblings. So no matter how isolated they are as a family, there are still human beings around to interact with. And then there's the other situation of physical space. Can you imagine a family that lives in an apartment that has 2 bedrooms and 1 little living room, and there they are all trapped together, as opposed to somebody with a great big house and a huge backyard and a swimming pool and whatever? There's it's like we're not really all in the same boat. You know, some of us are in yachts and some of us are in careening canoes. So I'm wondering about the gathering of data. You know, when you go in and talk to students, their experiences, when they answer your questions, a lot of their answers would be dependent upon, well, who are they and where do they live and what are their resources? So I'm just wondering how you dealt with that problem.
It's a great point, and it's very important, and it's something that sort of came up when celebrities started talking about their experience, and the rest of the country was like, that's not the COVID experience, you know, at least online. And so this is a really, really important point. And that's the differences were felt very acutely differently, even, I mean, depending certainly on race and gender and income and things like that, 100%. However, and of course, mine was a very casual, small, I just wanted to talk to actual live people. So I wouldn't call mine like research in any, it was very informal, and it just gave me some very intriguing insights. But in general, what is so interesting about this is that the sense of loneliness appears to not, it doesn't, the sense of loneliness transcends the specific life situations. And this is where that sense of being plugged in to the world has created this disconnect between their experience of self and their experience of connection with another person, because they have, when you think of, they have always moved through that channel to connect to other people. I say all the time to parents, if you take the phone away from a child, a person in this generation, they become profoundly claustrophobic.
Wow.
They become profoundly claustrophobic because they can no longer connect to their world in the way that they are used to connecting. The walls close in on them. This is not an experience that any of us in this room have, because we grew up on a developmental platform of kinesthetic interaction that these kids have not had. So it's not to say, and of course it's different if you've got 10 people in your house and you've got, you know, one person in your house with you as a young person, that affects you, but it's more about the way of interacting on that platform that appears to be, and then what COVID did was exacerbate that. It just made it worse, but we were already heading in that direction. I don't know if that makes it clearer, Eleanor.
Yes, it's very helpful. And I'm sure a lot of people listening to you are having experiences similar to what I see, which is when you take a phone away from your grandchildren, they can be 15 years old, they can be 12 years old, they are frantic. Mm-hmm. It's not like, oh no, I'm in the middle of the game, I've got this important. It is like almost as if you had beaten them. They are so upset.
Well, think of it as a limb. It's a kind of a limb. It's a way that they connect and they reach out. I mean, and we now are understanding the addictive component. It's also like removing an addict. We're now understanding that more and more. I just want to see Paula, her hand is up, or their hand is up.
Hello. Yes.
Hi.
I'm here because of Renee and Tom, who were kind enough to let me know. This was a great presentation. Thank you so much. Even today, when I work at Roger Williams University, like Renee, and even today coming out of class, I was talking to a friend of mine. I said, this is very perturbing, because I am seeing much of what you were able to describe. And this isolation and the sense that even if you approach with a question that doesn't have a right or wrong, a question that is in no way judgmental, it's a question about opinion, they are unable to respond. And we teach, Renee and I teach very small classes. So there is, in principle, a small cohort who relate to each other, and yet they are silent, right? They are silent. And so, of course, listening is great, but how do you listen if they are silent, right? That's the first question.
Yep.
Right? And then the second question is really a concern in terms of how can we change this dynamic slowly, because this puts us in a very difficult position, right? In terms of the next generation, those who are going to step up to power, those who are going to step up to take care of us who are elder, right? And
their
the
children.
fact that they cannot relate emotionally to another human being, right? Unless it is through media. I teach media. And they suck it all in. They have no critical understanding of who is lying to them and who is not. So that's a lot to ask, but I'd love to hear your comments, since you were able to break through in a way that I have not been able to break through.
Well, I don't have the answers. I don't think anyone has the answers. I think these are the very critical questions. And so one piece of this, which sounds kind of amorphous, but it's really not, is to live into this relational authority. Like to think about how we are showing up to them, how if they create being the kinds of people that they can trust, this matters almost more than anything else. And so, as you say, I like the fact that you said doing this slowly, because this is it's going to be a very gradual process. This is not a one and done. This is not going to be a quick fix. And what I believe is, and so here's sort of a trick. I was talking to young, very young millennials, sort of older Gen Z recently. And one of them was saying that they can't do online therapy. They have to have live therapy because they just can't. And so I was pushing that a little bit, like, why is it different? Because when we, in our generation, I remember when telehealth kind of came up and sort of people were like, oh, you can't do therapy on the computer, what? And then it ended up being this incredible thing, right? For them, it is not. And so it goes back to that thing of them, they see it in a box. It's a different world. It's a different way of being. It's almost a different self there. So when they're live, think of them as kind of, I almost said something that is not, I almost want to say like a shy, wild animal.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of the image that I have. And so for them, so you looking directly in the eye, like a face-to-face will shut them down. It's very, when you think about, like, they don't have time to think about what they're going to say. So side by side, instead of mirroring, is a way in. So if you can do something with them, where you're not looking at each other, but you're doing an activity together. So let's go walk here. Let's go do this thing. Let's do this activity. It's kind of it relaxes some of that skittish nervous system, and it will allow them to begin to talk, like outside of that direct thing. And then very slowly you can begin to, a little at a time, coming into more intimate. It's like intimacy. Like they don't know how to create intimacy with adults. They do it with each other, but they do it in this way, and it's a little bit hindered, and it doesn't have this kinesthetic quality. But with us, we're like, they're like, they just don't know. And again, I'm afraid to generalize here, because this is not true of there's so many youth that are not exhibiting these kinds of things. And so I don't want to say it's everyone, but it's a trend. And so for those who feel strongly affected by that, think about side-by-side action. Does that help?
Great tip. Thank you, Jeannette.
Any other thoughts here? I feel like it's too late to get into the whole sexuality thing, but I will say this is so worrisome to me, that, the notion of the the reward center getting triggered, like there's all these dopamine hits with social media. Pornography is absolutely a dopamine factory. That's exactly what it is, particularly for young men, born designated male. Putting those two things together, and the fact that pornography has become, obviously it's a massive industry, but it has actually broken out into the public. And so there's lots and lots of young people that see pornography. It's kind of like becoming an influencer. Like you can create a pornographic site and you get a lot of attention, and you get a lot of, and there's a lot of social acceptance around this. So rather than it being like, the sort of what we would think of, and we're of different generations, but like the pornography institutes, that doesn't exist anymore. It's flattened out, and it's across the board, and everyone has access and everyone can produce it. And so it's very, 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 very easy to access. Cost is no barrier because so much of it is free because it's being done in this way. And so there is such an incredible dopamine hit that it's becoming formative to sexual development for young men in particular. So being able to, so if you put together that idea of intimacy being challenging, the physical perfection and ideals that you can find, no matter what they are for you, you can find them online. And then the awkward actual person next to you in your classroom that you can't talk to, and doesn't look like this image, the disconnect that's being created there is it's this powerful schism. And actually Gen Z is having less sex than other generations of the past. Like they're actually having less sex. And so I'm really worried about how this is going to unfold and how it's going to roll out. So again, I'm going back to the OWL thing, like so important to be offering this kind of education in a broader and broader way.
Mhm.
So we're at the hour here, and I know that was a lot, and I appreciate, Eleanor, that was just I was like shooting information in the slides. I always have too much, but I really appreciate your interest. I really appreciate your willingness to be here, because a lot of people, I mean, if you have youth, this is up for you, but if you don't, then it's very easy to look the other way. And like what we, but this is an actual significant crisis of the caliber of the environment and some of the other things that we are facing. And it is exactly because, Paola, it's exactly what you said. I mean, this is the generation, they're going to be raising their own kids. They're going to be stepping into these institutions. They're going to be doing these, and they're really struggling. So it's about meeting them where they are now and finding the ways to connect with them and steward them as the wise elders that we are. And so using whatever capacity, back to what you said, Tom, whatever capacity we have available to us is the best one to use. What feels organic, where we can show up with that relational authority, that is the one to use. Work with the kid who's in front of you, basically. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Jeannette. This was wonderful.
I'm so glad.
Very helpful.
I'm so glad. I really am. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jeannette, thank you. That was a lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for having me, TLC, Susan. And I love coming to speak here. You're muted, Susan.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we'll have it on tape and on YouTube probably within a week. And
Awesome.
it'll be at the Channing YouTube channel under TLC.
That's awesome.
Very nice.
All right.
Really helpful information. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
glad. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Right.
Good night.
Have a great
Yeah.
night.